Welcome to Microsoft Dynamics CRM Online 2015 Update 1 Hybrid Server-Based SharePoint Integration. In this video, you'll learn how the server-based SharePoint integration is now supported for CRM Online to SharePoint on-premises. We'll spend a moment reviewing the benefits of server-based SharePoint integration compared to the list component. You'll understand the future plans to move away from the list component to using server-based SharePoint integration in all scenarios. Then we will review the changes to the configuration experience to enable CRM Online to be integrated with SharePoint on-premises, and we'll cover all of the requirements. In case you're not already familiar with it or need a refresher, let's spend a minute discussing the benefits of server-based SharePoint integration. As part of the CRM Online Spring 14 release, a new server-based SharePoint integration was introduced. Prior to this, SharePoint integration with CRM used something referred to as the list component. One of the reasons for introducing server-based SharePoint integration is because the list component relied on the sandboxed app model, which SharePoint has since deprecated. There are multiple other reasons though. The list component basically displayed SharePoint document libraries via an iframe, which did not provide a user experience that looked like the rest of the CRM application. Also, the prior integration with the list component ran client-side and did not provide a single sign-on experience. With server-based SharePoint integration, the communication is directly from the CRM server to SharePoint and does not require you to log in separately. One additional reason you'd want to use the new server-based SharePoint integration is because it is required for another great new feature introduced in CRM Online 2015 Update 1, and that is the new OneNote integration feature. So the server-based SharePoint integration was introduced as part of CRM Online Spring 14. That was also referred to as CRM 2013 Service Pack 1 for on-premises. But as part of that release, the only scenario that was supported was CRM Online to SharePoint Online. The other scenarios you might have, such as CRM Online to SharePoint on-premises, or CRM on-premises to SharePoint Online, or on-premise to on-premise, each of those scenarios then required you to use the list component. Now let's take a look at how this is changing in future releases. As part of CRM Online 2015 Update 1, one additional scenario that will be supported is CRM Online to SharePoint on-premises. Keep in mind that this release is only for online, so it won't be until a later release that the on-premises version of CRM will add support for SharePoint Online and then also CRM on-premises to SharePoint on-premises using the server-based integration. In the meantime, those other scenarios will need to use the list component. If you weren't already familiar with server-based SharePoint integration, here are some additional resources that you'll find helpful. One important thing to be aware of is that although CRM Online 2015 Update 1 introduces support for CRM Online to SharePoint on-premises, once you have that configured, the functionality is really identical to that initial release. So all these additional resources that have existed before would still apply. And the video in the middle is the YouTube video for the initial release of this feature, so that would still apply. And the link at the bottom here is for important considerations, and that would be especially helpful for customers that are currently using the list component and making the switch to server-based SharePoint integration. It would also still be helpful for you if you're a brand new customer and want to become more familiar with what's available as part of that feature. Let's take a quick moment to review the support roadmap for the list component. And as mentioned prior, the list component was the component used prior to the introduction of server-based SharePoint integration as a way of integrating CRM to SharePoint. And now the server-based SharePoint integration is starting to replace that. As part of CRM Online 2015 Update 1, one new supported scenario for the server-based SharePoint integration is CRM Online to SharePoint on-premises. But there are two different scenarios still that haven't been supported yet, and that is CRM on-premises to SharePoint Online and CRM on-premises to SharePoint on-premises. So as part of this latest release with CRM Online 2015 Update 1, only half of the different scenarios are currently supported by the server-based SharePoint integration. And for that reason, the list component is still supported in all the different scenarios at this time. In the next release that will end up adding support for the different on-premises scenarios, at that time the plan would be that all upgraded organizations that were using the list component would still be supported to use the list component, but any new organizations would only be able to use the server-based SharePoint integration, because at that time, new organizations, all the different scenarios will be able to use the server-based SharePoint integration because all scenarios will be covered. And then in the future release after that, the plan is to completely remove support for the list component. And part of this reason, again, is because it's based off of a technology from SharePoint that has been deprecated and is in the process of being removed by the SharePoint team. So the plan for a future release then is to completely remove support for the list component, and all new and upgraded organizations would have to use the server-based SharePoint integration to configure integration between CRM and SharePoint. As part of CRM Online 2015 Update 1, a new scenario is supported with server-based SharePoint integration, and that scenario is CRM Online to SharePoint on-premises. So as part of this section, we'll take a look at the different requirements. So one of the requirements is an Office 365 Global Administrator and also the SharePoint Farm Administrator for SharePoint on-premises. In an organization, this could potentially be the same person, but in other organizations, there might be two separate people that have these responsibilities. So in that case, multiple people may be required to perform this action. So there will be some PowerShell commands that need to be run on the SharePoint on-premises side, and that would need to be run by a SharePoint Farm Administrator. And at one point, you will be prompted for credentials for Office 365. And at that time, a Office 365 Global Administrator would need to provide their credentials to complete this configuration. As far as SharePoint requirements go, you need to have SharePoint Server 2013 with Service Pack 1 or later. And when we look at the link later on here in the next slide, there is a link to some specific hotfixes that need to be installed to support this integration. So next thing is that the SharePoint website needs to be available over the internet. And the reason for this is that CRM Online needs to be able to communicate with SharePoint. So that needs to be exposed over the internet using potentially something like a SharePoint proxy as an option. Another thing to be aware of is that that SharePoint website needs to be using SSL so that it's accessing using HTTPS. In relation to that, the certificate used for SSL needs to be set up using a publicly trusted root certificate authority. And the reason for that is that CRM Online needs to be able to communicate with that and needs to be able to trust that certificate. So it needs to be issued from a publicly trusted certificate authority. And another thing to be aware of is that you need to have a single SharePoint farm. It does not currently support multiple SharePoint farms. Lastly, but one of the most important things to be aware of is that it does require one SharePoint Online user license. You might be wondering, why is a SharePoint Online license required when you're using SharePoint on-premises? And the requirement comes down to you need to have a common trust broker between CRM Online and SharePoint, and that's set up through Azure ACS. And for this to happen, you need to have just one SharePoint Online license for all the necessary prerequisites to exist behind the scenes. Later on, you'll be running some PowerShell commands, and one of the things that will do is it'll set up a trust between your SharePoint on-premises environment and SharePoint Online, and then because of that, you're able to establish then that trust between CRM Online and SharePoint. So again, it's only one SharePoint Online license, and this isn't related to the number of SharePoint on-premises users you have. It's always only one SharePoint Online licenses as the requirement. So even though maybe you have potentially 1,000 on-premises SharePoint users, you still only need one SharePoint Online license, and it doesn't need to be assigned to anyone specific. So if you already potentially have a Office 365 subscription that includes SharePoint Online, one or more licenses as part of that, you're covered. All you need is one license, and it doesn't matter which type of SharePoint Online license, you just need one of them, whatever the type is. So server-based SharePoint integration initially released as part of CRM Online Spring 14, and in that release, the only supported scenario was CRM Online to SharePoint Online. As part of CRM Online 2015 Update 1, support is now added for CRM Online to SharePoint on-premises. So now when you're choosing to go to Settings, Administration, and Document Management, and you choose to set up the server-based SharePoint integration, you'll see a different option at the beginning where it allows you to now choose between SharePoint Online or SharePoint on-premises. If you choose SharePoint on-premises and then click Next, that next screen looks pretty much the same as what you would see if you chose SharePoint Online. You basically need to enter your URL for your SharePoint site. And for the case of on-premises, that does need to be a publicly accessible SharePoint on-premises site. It needs to be using HTTPS with a publicly trusted certificate. And then below that, you do have a link to a TechNet article for the different steps you need to run before it's going to be able to complete that trust between CRM Online to SharePoint on-premises. Next, we'll take a look at a pre-release version of that TechNet article. In addition to all the requirements that we covered in the prior slides, it also has all the different steps required to run PowerShell commands on the SharePoint side to establish that trust between CRM Online to SharePoint. Here is a pre-release version of that TechNet article, and the full link here will be provided in the next slide that I'll show after this. But I just wanted to show you a quick look at this, where it starts off by reviewing the different permissions required, which we already covered, of needing an Office 365 Global Administrator and also a SharePoint on-premises Farm Administrator. Then it gets into talking about some specific hotfixes that need to be applied on top of SharePoint 2013 SP1. Then it does mention the requirement of having a SharePoint Online license. And at the bottom here is where it starts getting into the different PowerShell commands you need to run through SharePoint 2013 Management Shell. And after you run this one right here, this is where you'll get prompted for credentials and need to be able to enter in the credentials of an Office 365 Global Administrator. Then you'll run some other commands, and a lot of these you just run as is. There are a few of them though where you do need to replace the sample value provided based off of what the URL is for your SharePoint site. So in this case, you would find out what's your URL and replace that host path here with what's here to provide the correct command. And you'll see if you go through here that there's just more and more PowerShell commands you need to run. They're broken out into smaller chunks so you can understand what each of them is doing. Also, at the bottom then, once you get completed with all those different PowerShell commands, it tells you how to go into CRM to get into settings, document management, and start going through that SharePoint integration wizard to set up the integration between CRM Online and SharePoint on premises. And we'll take a quick look at what that experience looks like. So once you've finished running those PowerShell commands on the SharePoint side, all you need to do is go to Settings and Document Management. And here you can choose Enable Server-Based SharePoint Integration. And you just click Next. And here, in this case, we're going to choose On Premises. Click Next. Here we just enter in our URL. And again, this would need to be the publicly exposed SharePoint on premises URL using HTTPS with a publicly trusted certificate. And here again is that direct link to that article that'll describe how to run the different PowerShell commands and all the different requirements. And once you click this, it'll verify that URL. And at that point, you should be able to test the server-based SharePoint integration. So here's that full URL to that TechNet article. This can also be found by going through that server-based SharePoint integration configuration wizard and just clicking on the link available through that second page after choosing the on-premises scenario. One thing shown here too is that this does have some logic to be able to handle different scenarios, such as if you didn't specify an HTTPS URL, it would check for that and block you from going forward. Also that there is some validation here where it would see that maybe it potentially wasn't able to connect, maybe because you haven't run those PowerShell commands yet on the SharePoint side, or maybe something else is missing. One thing that I haven't covered yet too is that there is some documentation covered here too of that by default the default claims that are used are the email address from SharePoint matching the email address on the CRM Online side, either the primary email address field or there's also a new field that's not exposed by default called SharePoint email address. So you just need to make sure that either the primary email address in CRM Online or the SharePoint email address in CRM Online matches whatever the email address is that's used in SharePoint. And also the article will take you to some information where it is possible to modify that default claims that are used. You could use something else other than email address if you want to. You can refer to the article for additional information about how to set that up. And here you can see that if it did fail, you would get a help link here. You can click on either this or the link here to take you to an article meant for troubleshooting issues with configuration. Also below here you can see an error log information, which is also a link where if you click on that, it'll show you additional details that you can look at to get a better idea of maybe why it wasn't successfully able to make that connection. Here are some additional resources you might find helpful. The first is that link for that TechNet article. The second one is that link that you get directed to automatically if you did run into an issue with the validation of your SharePoint URL. So here's the direct link to that. And then also I mentioned that it is possible to modify that default mapping that's set up where by default it's using email address to email address. So one thing to be aware of is that once you're setting that up, make sure that you do have the email address in CRM matching the email address in SharePoint, either in the primary email address field or in that new SharePoint email address field that's not exposed on the form by default. Otherwise, you need to go through and review this bottom article here of how to map some other claims that you maybe want to use instead of the email address attribute. If you watch all these different videos, you should now have an understanding of some of the benefits of server-based SharePoint integration. You should understand the different scenarios that are currently supported and what the plan is to support all the different scenarios in the future. Also how the list component has been deprecated and will eventually be unsupported in a future release. And we also covered all the different requirements of configuring the server-based SharePoint integration with CRM Online to SharePoint on premises. Thank you for taking the time to learn about how CRM Online is now supported with SharePoint on premises with server-based SharePoint integration as part of CRM Online 2015 Update 1.